In this video, I want to look at the way that we tend to argue in favor of skepticism in contemporary epistemology. And I'd like to reiterate what I said in a previous video, which is that, there aren't really skeptics in contemporary philosophy. It's not that people sort of come up with these arguments because they think that skepticism is true. Rather, skepticism is used as a methodological tool. We come up with skeptical arguments, and then we test our own epistemological theories by seeing how they deal with skepticism. Right? Is there a way that they can deal with skepticism? Can they show us that knowledge is possible? Or does the skeptic win? And if the skeptic wins, we are in trouble and we need to come up with a new idea. So that's how skeptical arguments get used. Okay, so here is a first type of skeptical argument that is very important. And it consists in the painting of a picture of a skeptical scenario that we can't show to be false. That in fact maybe we can't even really argue to be false. So the famous example, historically speaking, would be Descartes' evil demon. Right? There's supposed to be this very powerful being who is powerful enough that he can give me sensory experiences that have nothing to do with the world. Right? And so, I think I'm seeing a computer screen and a plant and a mug and things like that, but actually none of that exists. It's the evil demon giving me these impressions. And this evil demon is often updated into a scenario where, hey, I'm a brain in a vat connected to some kind of computer that generates a virtual reality environment, and that's what I'm experiencing. Right? So the idea is that my experiences are just not veridical, they're not true, they have nothing to do with the real world. Okay, well, here is the Cartesian way of arguing about this. It is to say the following. So first, you claim, well, this is at least possible, right? We can conceive of such a scenario. Second, well, that scenario is indistinguishable from a scenario where we really experience the world, right? It's indistinguishable. We couldn't tell the difference. Right? We could not tell the difference between really experiencing this world with plants and computer screens and being hooked up to this virtual reality machine where, we get simulated plants and screens even though the world is completely different. So we can't tell the difference. So the scenario is possible. We can't tell the difference between this bad skeptical scenario and the good reality scenario. And therefore, the argument would conclude, we cannot know that we're not in the skeptical scenario. Or maybe we could also conclude, we can't be justified in believing that we are not in the skeptical scenario. Here's a point I really want to make. Descartes always talks about this in terms of certainty, right? Descartes might say we can't be certain that we're not in the skeptical scenario. But that's really not the best way to think about this in terms of contemporary epistemology. Very few people want certainty, think that we can have it. But you don't need the idea of certainty to generate this skeptical argument. The point is, if we can't distinguish between the skeptical scenario on the one hand and the real world scenario on the other hand, then it seems that we don't even really have any reasons to believe that we are in the real world rather than the skeptical scenario. I mean, what reasons would those be? Not any reasons in experience, right? Because the experiences are the same. So, when we use this skeptical argument, the usual idea is that, well, certainly we don't know whether we are not in the skeptical scenario because we can't tell the difference. And maybe we're not even sort of reasonably justified in believing that we are not in the skeptical scenario because there are no real reasons that we can put forward. Okay. We could sort of augment maybe this argument or change it a little bit by pointing out that any attempt to justify our believing that we are in the real world is probably going to be circular. So for instance, suppose that I want to say, no, look, I mean, my sense perception works well. I'm seeing the real world. And you say, well, why? And I say, look, my sense perception works well because so far it has, always giving me correct information about the world. Well, how could I know that it's correct information about the world? Well, by checking it with my sense perception, right? I mean, there's no way to get out of that, right? It seems that I can only justify sense perception by using sense perception, because that's the only way I could reach the world. And so there doesn't seem to be any sort of non-circular argument to get me out of this problem where I can't argue in favor of the real world versus the skeptical scenario. Okay, so that's the first type of argument, you could say. We have a skeptical scenario, and the conclusion of the skeptical scenario is that we don't know we don't know that we are not in the skeptical scenario. Okay, we don't know that we are not a brain in a vat. We don't know that we are not deceived by an evil demon, and so on. Now, bring in the second type of argument, which is actually the one that's most often discussed in the contemporary literature. The second type of argument takes this failure of knowledge from the first type of argument and then blows it up. Because it takes this idea that we don't know that we are not in a skeptical scenario. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. And it turns it into a failure to know more or less anything at all. So here's an example of that argument. Okay, suppose. If I knew that I had two hands, that's Moore's example. Let's use a better example. If I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, If I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Yeah, because a brain in a vat can't wear really cool sweaters, right? He doesn't have a body. So if I know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. That's the first premise. Well, the second premise is the one that we got from the previous argument. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, right? Because it's indistinguishable from, my experience is indistinguishable from that of a brain in a vat. So I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. But then it follows by simple logic that I also don't know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater. Right? If I know that I wear a really cool sweater, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. But I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know that I'm wearing a really cool sweater. And this is true for basically anything, right? I mean, if I know that I'm seeing a tree, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. But I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know that I'm seeing a tree, and so on and so forth. Like, everything collapses. So this second type of argument takes the skeptical scenario and turns it into a collapse of almost everything we think we know. So, two remarks I want to make about this second type of argument. The first is that it uses something that is usually called a closure principle. So what's a closure principle? Well, a closure principle in general is something that says, well, if you've got a set of stuff that belongs to a certain category, then there is a sort of procedure that tells you what other stuff also belongs to that category. So that may be a little bit weird or a little bit abstract, but let me... here's an example. Here's an example that has nothing to do with knowledge, and I'll give you the knowledge example in a second. So let's take the natural numbers, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, here's a closure principle. If some number is a natural number, then that number plus 1 is also a natural number, right? If 17 is a natural number, then 18 is also a natural number. That's right. That's right. I mean, if something is a natural number and you add 1, it's once again a natural number. That's a closure principle. Okay, here's a closure principle that a lot of people think must be right about knowledge. If I know something, let's call it P. If I know P, and I know that P logically implies Q, so if P is true, Q has to be true as well, then I also know Q. Right? If I know P, and I know that P implies Q, then I know Q. Right? If I know that it is a weekday, and I know that if it's a weekday, it's not Sunday, then I know that it's not Sunday. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? And it's that closure principle that allows us to say in the argument that we've just been given, that if I know that I'm wearing a cool sweater, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Because if I'm wearing a cool sweater, I can't be a brain in a vat, right? I mean, wearing a cool sweater implies not being a brain in a vat. So it's a closure principle about knowledge that allows us to claim that if I know that I'm wearing a cool sweater, I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. And that's what generates trouble, right? Because I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Also, the first argument for skepticism told us, and that means that I don't know that I'm wearing a cool sweater, and in fact that I don't know much of anything at all. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. And the second thing I want to remark about this type of argument is that I've been talking in terms of knowledge. You could also give it in terms of justification, right? If I'm justified in believing that I'm wearing a cool sweater, then I'm justified in believing that I'm not a brain in a vat. But I'm not justified in believing that I'm not a brain in a vat, so I'm not justified in believing that I'm wearing a cool sweater, right? You can do it, I would say, more or less as easily with justification as you can do it with knowledge, and that's actually going to be relevant, not now, but in our next video, when we look at several responses to skepticism.